My name is David Halkett, and I'm a trained archaeologist. I don't know if you know that term, archaeologist. Person who studies the past, particularly where things are associated with human history. You would have heard of a geologist, is a person who studies the rocks and things, not necessarily created by man, but they study the old layers of the rocks and the mountains. And whereas I study the people who maybe lived in amongst those rocks and those mountains over many thousands, if not millions of years. You might know that in Africa, we believe this is where people became proper modern humans, such as you and I today. But originally in East Africa, people who weren't fully modern evolved, and they started making stone tools, probably wooden tools and bone tools, so that they could hunt animals or butcher the animals so they could eat the meat. Kan almal Engels verstaan of ek sal probeer elke nou en dan in Afrikaans praat, maar my Afrikaans is nie so goed nie. So ek studeer hierdie ou goed wat ons kry. Ek is 'n commercial archaeologist, so in ander woorde, ek gebruik my studies om te werk in die veld en die wet, the law and the Heritage Resources Act of South Africa requires that any developments have a study done on the heritage to see if there's anything that's going to be disturbed before they do that development. So that's what I do a lot of the time. I go and I look and see, is there any heritage at this place where they're going to disturb? And must it be rescued, or is it not of such a type that needs to be rescued? So I've been staying in Barrydale now for about 5 years, permanently since the COVID epidemic has started. I've been staying here. And I've for a long time been looking for things in the veld here. Just when I go on walks and things, I look for things in the veld, but I haven't had a lot of success in finding stuff. And I think when you spend a winter or two in Barrydale, you can understand why perhaps people weren't living outside in the mountains and things if they couldn't find a cave or a rock shelter or something. It's just too cold. So I think that's a lot of time why you don't find a lot of stuff. You find at Warmwaterberg, you will find stuff there. And here in the pass, up above Stonehaven, you find rock paintings and stone implements from the late Stone Age. But that's much more recent, and people then had fires, so they could keep themselves warm and stay in the caves. But a few months ago, Flora, myself, and some other people were up in the hiking trail, and we were taking out some of the alien vegetation there. And I was cutting a bush, and I looked at my feet, and I saw this. And it's what we call, in archaeology, we call this a hand axe. And it is the most common tool, the common stone tool, made during what we call the early Stone Age. And this thing here in my hand was common between about 700,000 years ago and about 300,000 years ago. We can't say exactly. This was just found on the surface. You'll see when I pass it around, it's quite weathered, it's eroded, it's been lying on the surface, in the veld for many, many thousands of years. So they weather, the wind, the sand has polished it, the water's polished it. So we can see that it's been lying there for a long time. I'm going to pass it around. Flora's seen it.
Thank you, Dave. I'll have another look.
Now, when I say these things are so old, 700,000 years ago, you say, well, how do we know that it's 700,000 years or 300,000 years? Well, sometimes you are lucky and you find them buried inside a cave in the soil. And then you can look and you can see what's lying next to it in a particular layer. And if you're lucky, it's got something that you can use for dating. So I can put it through a machine and it can tell me this layer is that old, or that layer is that old, or it lies below that layer which is so old. But it's difficult with this very old material. We need to have certain things in place for it to be successfully dated. Most of the time you find them in the open. They're so old that when they were first deposited on the landscape, everything else has been eroded, so they all settle down onto one common layer. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense to you. So we often find these things in the wheat fields, out on the Swartland, where the farmers go and they plow, and they drag off all the rocks and they put them in the corner of the field. Often if you go and look in there, you'll find quite a few of these things. But because they were used for so many thousands, millions of years, they're just everywhere in the veldt. You find them widely scattered, and it's because people spend so much time walking across that landscape, using that landscape, that they drop them all over the show. Okay? Particularly in places like river valleys, like the Olifants River Valley near Clanwilliam. Oh, there are many thousands of these things in the gravels of the old rivers. But in many other places you find them too, but particularly along old river valleys.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
What were they mainly used for? Because you say hand axe.
Yes.
I know they were used to make other hand axes and chip away at stones and stuff.
Well, obviously we don't have the exact knowledge of what people were using them for, because they're so old, but people have done experiments with them. They've cut up meat successfully with them when they're fresh. This one's a bit weathered, so it's blunt now.
When you skin a carcass,
you can skin. I've
skin
seen a film of somebody butchering an elephant with one of these when it's fresh and sharp. You've got to keep resharpening it, obviously, and if you hit a bone, then it gets blunt. So, and in more recent times, they've used very, very careful scientific methods to look at these things where they've been preserved in soils, and they've found residues of meat and plant material.
Okay.
So it's probably the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age,
yes.
The early Stone Age. So it was a multi-purpose tool. You would dig out a root, a comb, a bulb, chop some wood, cut up an elephant, maybe kill a bokkie.
And these are also, they are harder than the other rocks that they're not found around.
They would always, that's a good question. You can't make a hand axe out of a soft rock, because, you know, as soon as you use it, it's going to get blunt or it's going to break. So you're usually using a rock type which is quite hard. So this one is made out of a sandstone, or a hardened Table Mountain sandstone, or a quartzite, okay, which is a much harder rock than you would find in some of these koppies that you find at the back here, the shales, those layered stones that we also that they build the walls with. No good for these kinds of things. Always a hard stone. And I just pass around a few examples from other sites, so you can see it's quite a common shape. And it's because of its shape, it's sometimes referred to, the farmers, if you go to their fields and you say to them, have you got any amandelstene? And then they know exactly what you're talking about, because it looks like an almond nut. So if ever you want to know if they've got, you ask them for amandelstene.
Are these all from the same age, more or less?
You know, as I say, they come commonly from within that 700,000 to 300,000 period. But in South Africa, we seldom find them where they're buried in caves. It's mostly out in the open, where you don't have evidence of how They stack in terms of time. The one exception, and quite a rare site, is Montague Cave, the Guano Cave. You probably all know the Guano Caves down just outside of Montague. And that's one of the few places in South Africa where you find these kind of tools buried in a cave. And they're buried under many meters of soil, which accumulated over thousands of years as people lived in those caves. And they are found to be underneath two other major stone tool units in southern Africa. You get, as I say, the late Stone Age is the most recent period where people were living on the landscape, and then you get something called the Middle Stone Age, and then you get the Early Stone Age. So the Middle Stone Age went from about 300,000 years ago to about 50,000 years ago, and then from about 50,000 years ago to the present would be the late Stone Age. Well, to about 250 years ago, of course. Yeah, so as I say, these are not commonly found around Barrydale, so I was very glad to see this. And obviously now that I found one keeps one's eyes open. There will probably be more. What else can I tell you? Have you got any questions?
Die klippe,
Ja.
is dit waardevol soos, ek weet hulle ouderdom, maak hulle spesiaal van diamante, waarde,
Ja.
ook ondergronde, so, wat is die klip se waarde?
Dit het nie eintlik geldelike waarde nie. Ja, dis vir die geskiedenis, vir science is hy belangrik. Want dit laat ons weet waar het mense gebly in die ou dae. Ons kry selde dat hy is begrawe met, soos ek sê, met ander goed wat ons laat weet wat die mense geëet het. Montague Cave is een van die plekke, dat is miskien 5 of 6 ander grotte in Suid-Afrika waar jy kry hierdie goed in grotte begrawe. So, maar soos ek sê, jy kry duisende, miljoene van hierdie goed in die oop veld. So.
In Barrydale, dan Barrydale is ook 'n oop veld vir soos edelstene, wat geskiedenis daar soos die klippe, sal mense dit vind hier in ons omgewing.
Die een kom van Barrydale.
Ek weet soos die mense sê dit, maar ons is ons nie bewus van, ons loop net, ons sien 'n klip, ek kom agter klippe vergaan nie.
Kyk, soos ek sê, ek stap nou gereeld in die veld en ek kry baie min in Barrydale self. Maar Warmwaterberg en hier in die Paas, daar kry jy goed in die berg. Maar dis die eerste een, en ek weet nie hoeveel keer ons daarbo was om daai bome te sny, maar dis die eerste een wat ek kry. So dis die ding. Enige ander vrae?
Yeah, we're quite interested in the early humans. Did you say that they originated in the East Africa? And then?
Karen?
Okay, so.
You might know that sort of when we look at evolution of the human species, that in the past it was fairly incomplete. Nowadays, with science improving at such a rapid rate, we're discovering new species of humans just about yearly. So there are many different types of species that evolved in Africa first, it seems, not in the rest of the world. Humans evolved in Africa. There seems to be no doubt about that. People started making stone tools for the first time in Africa at about 3.5 million years ago. That's what science tells us at the present. Archeologists have found these old, very old, not like this, even more primitive than this, just simple rocks with a few pieces chopped off them. So people were using those from about 3.5 million years ago. where the people would have looked very different to what we look like today.
Just as an implement, it had quite a good run because it was 2-3 million years. It was,
Yeah.
the main implement in use.
Yeah, so people were using rocks, and probably they were using bone and wood as well, but those obviously don't survive. So, but we know that these things started at about 700,000, and they were probably being made by people, we call people in inverted commas. They weren't properly human yet, their brains weren't quite the same as ours, they weren't thinking quite as well. But we know that because they were making these, they knew how to think laterally and how to make things. And those we would call people, a whole range now that been discovered: Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo heidelbergensis. So there's a whole list of these different people. So these humans, we call inverted commas, started in Africa, and then at some point in time, they moved out of Africa. They discovered they could travel to other parts of the world. So they moved to Europe, Asia, and carried on evolving in those places. But in Africa, people carried on evolving and making. They got to the Middle Stone Age and they started making different kinds of tools, and the kinds of tools they were making indicate to us that they were putting them on the tips of arrows and spears. So their technology, their knowledge of hunting had evolved a lot. And people then moved out of Africa again. So there was the second movement of people out of Africa into Europe and into Asia, and probably as far as Australia. And then, as I said, with the Middle Stone Age kept evolving, and then eventually it swapped over. People, their brains had become far more evolved. Probably because they were eating a lot better, because they could hunt more. So the feeding of the brain helped, and it evolved, and they could think more carefully, make better tools, hunt better, make better places to stay. And that's what we call the late Stone Age, and it is typified by very specific tools. This one was no longer used. It was too crude, and people would come up with other things: bone, very finely made stone tools, wooden tools. They would make decorations. None of these things seem to have occurred in the early Stone Age. So that's how we know how people's brains were developing, by looking at what they leave behind and how they were making them, is an indication.
As ook, soos ek luister, van ek het al op movies gesien soos, dan vat mense 2 klippe in die woud en maak hulle
Dis hom. Ja.
Met vonkies, maar ek het twyfel of dit altyd waar is, want een vonkie kan ons nou nie. Ja, ek weet, daar's gesegde, een vonkie kan die hele woud afbrand.
Ja, jy kan vonke maak van die klippe wat jy optel in die veld, maar jy moet spesifiek weet watter klippe het is. Nie alles sal 'n vonk maak.
Ons het revolusie gedoen op skool van, dan ek kon nou nog my onderwyser vir lewenswetenskap, meneer Brand, dat hulle altyd die grap maak, wie was eerste, die hoender of die eier? Van dan was daar 'n handboeke van die revolusie wat verander het, van ons was eers apies of daai my glo nie en dit nie, en toe verloor ons die steer. Soos mense, ek dink die mense wat daai tyd gelewe het, het die klere gehad, ek sien ons maar nou soos, dat is maar net toegemaak hier, nee. Hulle, ek glo nie aan die revolusie nie, ek glo van, soos ek geluister het, hulle brein het meer ontwikkel. Ek dink oorlewing het dit gedoen, want hulle het gesien, hulle moet eet, hulle het geweet, hulle moet 'n blyplek hê, hulle het geweet hoe om goed aan te pas met dit. So ek glo nie van, soos ek geluister het na wat jy gesê het, hulle brein het beter ontwikkel, want dit was nou, ek weet, maar ek dink dit is seker wat oorlewing.
Dis waar.
Want oorlewing, as mense nou ookie is, dan gaan jy mos nie daar bly of iets nie.
En die wetenskaplikes dink dat die brein se ontwikkeling het vinniger in Afrika gebeur omdat mense langs die kus het die seekos geëet. Daar's spesifieke goed in die seekos wat baie goed vir die brein se ontwikkeling is. Ja. Jou ma het seker vir jou gesê, eet jou vis, dit sal jou brein laat groei, né?
Ek weet van die proteïen.
Ja. So, dis wat ons dink. Maar soos ek sê, die wetenskap verander so vinnig nou die dae, dat ons weet nuwe dinge so elke dag, jy weet, en gebruik van computers om te studeer hoe verander hierdie klippe ensovoorts. Dit help ons baie.
Wat se kos was beskikbaar daai tyd vir die mense? Ek weet nou net van vleis en daar was seker vrugte in die omgewing, want hulle het mos in bosse en so.
Ja, daar sal seker, soos jy sê, baie diere gewees het. Hulle het seker geweet van veldkos, en ons dink hierdie goed is gebruik om veldkos uit te grawe, want soos ek sê, hulle het gekry oorskot van plantmateriaal wat is in die gaatjies in die van die tool in, jy weet, hy's gevang daar. En as hulle kyk onder in die mikroskoop, dan sien hulle hierdie stukkies van veldkos of vleis of wat ook al. So in die tydperk sal daar baie van die diere gewees het wat ons nou ken. Olifante, hippos, klein bokkies. Maar daar's ook diere wat nou uitgesterf het, wat hulle geëet het. Ja.
Gelukkig het al die paddas nie uitgesterf.
Hulle het seker paddas geëet ook, insekte. Ja, as jy kyk wat die bobbejane eet, ons het seker ook geëet wat hulle eet.
Ek is bly ek is
Termiete is baie goed.
Wat is baie goed?
Termiete,
Die mure,
maak hom net so 'n bietjie met die brein op die vuur en dan kan jy eet.
Daar groot mure wat uit eet.
Ek is bly ek is nie in 97 gebore.
Ja. Ja, toe, is daar enige ander vrae?
A couple of years ago we were in Stilbaai,
Yes.
and there was a little museum there. And I think they were telling us that the earliest humans lived in the region. Is that right? The Blombos Cave.
Yes, we need to make the distinction. We talk about early modern humans. And there is some indication, Blombos Cave at Stilbaai is amongst some of the earliest evidence of early modern humans on the southern African continent. But, you know, now the guys at Mossel Bay are claiming that that's where they evolved, you know. So it just depends. Whoever happens to find the oldest evidence at the time claims that that's where modern humans evolved. But certainly, as I described, the Middle Stone Age, that's an indication where people's brains had started to, they'd taken a leap from the period when they were making these things. And they were now able to make very finely crafted points and things which the evidence is starting to suggest were used as spear or projectile points, spears or arrows. And obviously, the development of that kind of technology again points to quite an improvement in the way our brains were working. And as I say, Stilbaai is also one of these coastal areas, and the kinds of stone tools that you find on those types of sites seem to be limited to the coastline. You don't seem to find them inland. So it's again maybe some indication that that seafood thing might not be a myth, and it might really be assisting with improvements in the formation of the brain.
I mean, people living at Warmwaterberg in the past,
Yes.
300,000 years ago.
There would have been people living here, as this is evidence of, 700 or even further back. But the people who were staying at Warmwaterberg that I'm talking about were people from the late Stone Age, so within the last 30,000 years. And the Warmwaterberg stuff and the stuff in the past here probably is only from about the last 5,000 years or so. So they were making paintings on the rocks. They were making very specific, small little tools, nothing like this anymore, tiny little tools. They sometimes were making pottery. That comes in about 2,000 years ago. People start making pottery in southern Africa. And that wasn't here before. So those are, again, you know, an indication of how you can use a particular kind of tool to say how old they are and what period of the Stone Age they fall into. All right. I meant to say to you that these ones here, these three, those are from the Olifants River. I was up there a couple of weeks ago and we found these three next to the river, these three here. This one's from Europe, and this is a drawing of a hand axe, and this one just shows you an actual artifact. And as archaeologists, we often draw the artifacts because it's much easier to see how the flaking took place on the tool itself. So often when people publish their scientific findings of something, they will often draw the artifacts rather than put photographs because it's much easier to describe the way the artifact was made. I'll leave these here. You can keep these just as an example. All right.
I think we're stunned by the time span.
Huge time.
300,000, 700,000.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Huge time depth.
So we are really from somewhere else as human beings.
Yeah, I think we're all Africans. We're all evolved in this continent.
So that people,
Yeah.
we are involved in Africa and then we spread to the
Yeah.
rest of the world.
Yeah. And then we all came back again. But I think we can all say that all humans have a very direct link to Africa. Yeah. And you might have heard of the Neanderthals who evolved in Europe. We don't get Neanderthals in Africa, Neanderthal man.
Yeah, they just found a new one too,
They-
the Denisovans.
Well, nobody's actually seen a Denisovan. We only know about Denisovans from genetics and tiny pieces of bone found at the Denisova cave in Russia. But essentially, you can see their DNA in humans today. And in fact, we all carry a very small percentage of Neanderthal DNA to indicate that humans and Neanderthals, because we were separate species at that stage, were mixing. And so we still carry some of their DNA in us today.
Accounts for some behavior.
Huh?
Some of the behavior accounts for.
The French rugby team, I think. All right. And if there are any other things that you're interested in, I'll see when I have more time on my hands, then I'll maybe come back later in the year and I'll talk to you about some other things that we've found in South Africa.
Well, that'd be good. You know, we're trying to put together a story for the puppet show we do at the end of the year.
Yes.
And this year we've got a very ancient tree, an ancient guardi tree that can talk.
Okay.
And there's a young girl, and she's based on the character of Greta Thunberg,
Oh, yes.
activist.
Yes.
And she's got a relationship with the tree. And what they found is a woman politician, local one, comes and she's got a guy from a pharmaceutical company with her. And they just looking at the vegetation and he's saying, look at that. That's what we could dig out and
Yes.
use. We can just come up and dig everything up, and and they don't care that once it's dug up,
Yeah.
it's gone forever. They just move on to the next bit. But then they've got a new idea. He said, no, we're also going to drill and try to find hot water so we can have a spa. And then they said, and what about a casino? So we can just clear everything.
Yeah.
We have a wonderful casino. All the farm workers can come Friday night and,
Yeah.
gamble with their money.
Yeah.
And so of course the Greta character is going to fight against all this. And I think she wants everybody, we want people to realize what they would be losing, if everything was just
Yes.
away
Yes.
to make work.
Absolutely.
Place or casino.
Yeah.
So and not only the present but all the heritage from the past.
Yeah.
So it was like what you were saying earlier, that if you did an assessment, say people did actually want to build a casino here, and you were asked to come and do a heritage assessment, what would you say?
Yes, we're certainly doing an assessment. I can give you an example of casinos. Was the Caledon Casino. We did an assessment of the Caledon Casino. So that's a case in point where, yeah. And they were very naughty. In fact, they destroyed some heritage which was of great significance.
Yeah.
Mm.
So there might be something here too that we also want to preserve.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes, yes.
Okay.
We think of stone tools, but obviously our heritage is other things. It's buildings. The old buildings we find in the veld and old kraals, and were made out of stone. That's also a heritage. That's important. Places where people have respected or revere as important to their cultures. Rock features, rivers. That's all part of our cultural heritage. And in fact, if I do an assessment, I've got to think of that stuff too. I can't just focus on stone tools and buildings. You've got to think about things which are important to people and important to our culture in general. Ja.
En wat dink jy is die rede hoekom die koei en die san op rotse geskryf het? Is daar 'n rede of het hulle dit net gedoen?
Kyk, ons sal nie heeltemal weet hoekom hulle dit gedoen het, maar daar is soos ek sê, die wetenskaplike mense wat die goed bestudeer. Hulle dink dis deel van die mense se wat noem mens religion. As die mense, kyk, hulle het nie so 'n religion soos ons nou vandag weet met die kerk en sulke goed. Maar daar is seker wat ons noem medicine men of shamans wat binne in daai groepe gewoon het. Sangoma, 'n tipe van 'n sangoma wat hy was 'n tipe van 'n dokter, maar hy weet van die kop en kwale en sulke goed en van die plantkos wat kan help en as 'n mens kyk in die Kalahari waar mense die Boesmanne bestudeer het jare terug, het hulle gesien dat hulle doen so dans waar die shamans so begin so snaaks te voel en hulle gaan in so 'n ander tipe what we call they go into a trance. So as jy te veel, ek weet jy rook nie dagga nie, maar as jy te veel dagga gerook het, jy weet jy raak so 'n bietjie bedonderd, né? En nou as hulle so van hierdie danse doen, dan raak hulle so. En dan toe hulle in daai when they were in that state, that's when we think they were doing the paintings. Because they paint things that you will only see when you're in that kind of a state. So it might be that they were putting those images there to tell other people what they had seen. If that makes sense.
Ek verstaan.
If that makes sense. So other people could come years later, like this. They're recording it now. So you can look at it later. So if that shaman painted on the wall, you can come back there in 3 years and go and look and you say, oh yes, I remember that dance. I remember what he was painting, what he was telling us. So.
En my laaste vraag, die diere wat eintlik vrylik gewees het. As jy miskien 'n rede het, hoekom dit nie meer vandag so sê, hoe gevaarlik was die leeu's teen, hoe die mense altyd gewoon teen die natuur van 'n leeu sal hulle mos eet. Ek sit daar om te dink wat 'n olifant kan doen aan 'n mens. Hoe was hulle oorlewing met diere? As jy kennis het en diere was vrylik daai tyd, dink jy dit is reg dat hulle nou omheen is?
Ja. Ek dink as 'n mens dink van daar's luiperde wat in die berg woon vandag.
Ek weet nog van dit, ja.
Ons lewe saam met hulle. Hulle lewe saam met ons. Ons leer om mekaar te ken en ons gewoontes te ken. So ons bly weg van die leeu's. Die leeu's miskien bly weg van ons, want anders kap ons hom oor die kop met daai ding. Jy weet, so dis al. Maar ons weet, die leeu's, nie spesifiek die leeu's nie, maar ons het gekry op die Weskus in grotte, waar daar oermense ingetrek is deur hyenes. Deur hyenes. Die mense, ons weet nie of hulle normaal gesterf het, en daar gelê, toe kom die hyene en sien, hierso is net nog 'n stuk vleis vir die hyene. Sluip hom terug in sy grot. En ons het gekry van daai ou mense. So daar was mense wat geëet was deur die leeu's en die predators. Maar daar was ook, ons weet, hulle het van die diere geëet. So dit was 'n two-way street. Ja.
Ek doen nie eintlik of support nie altyd die geskiedenis soos in, ek hou nie van wat gebeur in daai tyd nie, maar tog stel ek belang om te hoor van hoe mense gesterf het op daai manier.
Ja.